I have a talk for you this morning that it starts off a little intense. I'm sorry, because it's the morning. I'm going to use a couple big words. I'm not going to go too big into it. But I pitched this talk as, what is a Rubyist? Because as Josh mentioned, I've sort of been doing a little bit less Ruby work nowadays, although I still have a bunch of gems that I'm maintaining, but I've sort of stepped away from my Rails development. But I still consider myself to be a Ruby programmer, and I love coming to Ruby conferences, and you all are my friends, and you're great. And so there's this interesting thing that happens when you have a career and there's some progression and then you do other stuff. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about why, if I don't do a lot of Ruby, why do I still come to Ruby things all the time? I have a little Ruby tattooed on my body. That's how much I like Ruby, if you didn't know. And so I think that the answer to this comes down to the question that is in the title of the talk. What is a Rubyist? Why do I call myself a Rubyist even though I write less Ruby now? So we're going to start with Plato. So there's this part of philosophy called ontology. And ontology basically asks the question, what kind of stuff is there? And what kind of things are there? That's basically all it means, ontology. And there are interesting sub-questions in this field. Of course, I'm not going to go through thousands of years of philosophy for you, but Plato was interested in this question, and he came up with this idea called the theory of forms. And why this matters to you is because Plato basically invented object-oriented programming a long time before object-oriented programming actually happened. I also fundamentally disagree with it as an ontological commitment, which is fun, working in object-oriented programming language. But basically the idea that Plato had was that we could declare what stuff exists by certain properties that it has. So for example, a tree has a trunk, and a tree has leaves, and those leaves are green. And so if you have a trunk and you have green leaves, then you're a tree, as a random example. This is the same way that our models work in a Rails application, right? So your user has a username and hopefully a hashed password, not just a password, and a bunch of other attributes that make up what that thing actually is. But as we know, it's very difficult to model the real world in these kinds of applications, right? Especially as things change over time. So what happens when your user account goes away and then you reactivate it, and there's all this kind of stuff that can make this kind of modeling difficult. And I think there's a lot of stuff that's interesting about the concept of time and programming and how you encode it, but that's not this talk, so I'm going to shut up about that right now. So if Plato's wrong, who's right? I don't think that necessarily it's as strictly good as wrong and right, but sort of the way that I think about these problems is through this concept called process philosophy, which basically says it's not about attributes that define identity. It's about what you do that defines your identity. So instead of saying a Rubyist is someone who has some sort of attribute necessary for being a Rubyist, for example, having a Twitter account, or having a GitHub account, or coming to Ruby conferences, instead, you're a Rubyist if you do Ruby stuff. If you're part of the historical process of Ruby as it goes through the ages. And I think this is a much more interesting idea because it also allows for us to not just be Rubyists, but also be JavaScript programmers, and also be Java developers, and also be PHP developers. And we don't have to solely tie our identities so strongly to one programming language. And I think it's a really positive thing. There's another concept that comes up in process philosophy, and then I'm going to shut up about this philosophy stuff that I think is really interesting, called an assemblage. And basically the idea is that once you get away from this idea of essential attributes, it's harder to define groups of things. So for example, what is RubyConf Australia? Well, in a certain sense, it's all of us coming together to attend it, but sometimes people sleep in and they miss the first couple talks, or they leave early, or they come in the middle. And so actually it's much more like this amorphous group of people that come into and out of and shuffle around. But we're no longer RubyConf Australia if we're missing one person, or if we bring in an extra person, right? It's this social thing that we do. And that's the way that I think that it is important to think about Ruby and Ruby programmers and being Rubyists, is we're this big community of people who have people that filter in and out, and that's an okay and natural and important part of this process. So as someone who is sort of in this process of stepping into and out of Ruby on a relatively rapid basis, I have some thoughts for you about the way that the Ruby community should go. As someone who's stepped out of Ruby world for a little while to a certain degree, I have some additional perspective that comes from being slightly outside of Ruby for a little while. And I'd like to share that with you today. And that's sort of the subject of the rest of this talk. now that I'm done with all that heavy thing. Sorry, it's the morning, it's early, I got to slip that in. But okay, so what should we as Rubyists do going into the future? I think the most important thing is actually two important things. It's so hard. Things are hard to categorize. The most important thing is to stop talking so much trash. This ties really into another really important concept that I think that we as a community need to understand and internalize, and that's that we're not actually the cool kids anymore. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, but like there are very few startups that brag about using Rails as their competitive advantage. Like, when was the last time that you, not that oh God, I almost said this without the disclaimer. I would never advocate that anyone ever reads Hacker News, first of all. But if you were to do so, through whatever reason, it's been a really long time since there's been a post on Hacker News that's like, check out my new cool startup. By the way, we're using Rails. Isn't that awesome? And I think that this is okay, and it's good, actually, in many ways. But I think the problem is that we haven't realized that that's good and okay. So, for example, every time, and we've already made a couple DHH jokes, and all I will say is that that slide that was presented yesterday with the "fuck you" written on it, certain people who lead our community have set a tone that I think is harming us. I'll just leave you to fill in the blanks. And the problem is like, every time we talk trash on Java people, I can't help but think that like we're those Java people that we're making fun of. Like, in many ways, this concept of like, maybe active record should not be your sole persistence layer, and we should build domain objects and then have a separate persistence layer that maps those objects to our persistence. Java programmers have been doing that for a long time, and like, maybe if we weren't so busy making fun of them, we wouldn't have had these years of like angst about active record, and we could have just like used the thing that they had already found out was good, but we were all too busy making fun of Java. And this also matters because in some ways the JVM and Java might be the future of Ruby. I don't know if you've been seeing the work that Charlie Nutter and the JRuby team have been doing lately, but it's amazing. Like, really, really amazing. This whole Java 9000 shenanigans that they're putting on might actually make Ruby a fast programming language. And that's not even including all the typing stuff that Tom was talking about yesterday, which also is something that would be a really big improvement for Ruby. And so I want to get into that more in a moment, but there's this important model that it's kind of this like businessy book, so I kind of hate like recommending it, but at the same time, I think it's a useful model for thinking about these kinds of things, and everybody else does too, because there's like been a billion copies sold over the last 15 years. It's called Crossing the Chasm. Has anyone read Crossing the Chasm? Yeah, you got a couple cans up. So the idea, the guy that wrote it, I totally forget his name because I take terrible notes in said Moleskine. Crossing the Chasm is about the process by which new technology and or new businesses get adopted by the population at large. And so there's sort of this like curve, this bell curve, that's like small at the beginning and small at the end and fat in the middle, kind of like if you look at what an IQ distribution is supposed to be. I forget what the math formula for that is. I was so bad at math. But basically, the idea is that there's 5 different groups of people that are involved, 5 cohorts that are involved in adopting a new technology or something, or a new business. They're called the innovators, are the earliest group of people, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. And the idea is that the innovators are those people who, I will say, a great example of innovators right now is the Rust world, which means we're breaking the language every single week. Sorry. And like, no person in their right mind would ever use that for production, like, because we're breaking things every week. But it means there's a lot of interesting developments that are going on and a lot of cool stuff that's happening, but only a small number of people are willing to put up with that kind of crap all the time. And so the innovators chunk is very tiny. Then there's the early adopters. This is what happens when a technology starts to mature a little bit and you start to see people actually using it for real things and the community grows. I think that Go is a good example of a technology that's in the early adopter phase right now. There's a lot of people who are really excited. There's a lot of people who aren't really interested in using it yet because they want to see how everything shakes out. It's not quite mature enough for their usage or understanding. And so you have like more people using it, but not everyone. The reason that the book is called Crossing the Chasm is because between the early adopters and the next cohort, the early majority, there's a big gap. And basically, technologies succeed or fail based on whether they're able to jump over that gap from the early adopters to the early majority. And the reason that there's a gap is because some technologies basically just like fizzle out. So they're like not good enough for some reason, or something bad happens. I won't talk about programming languages that have failed to cross this chasm because, again, I'm trying to talk less trash all the time. But if you manage to jump over to the early majority, that's when you've sort of made it. And that means that you get to like succeed through the rest of this like period of history. I'm not sure of a good programming language that's recently made that jump, but the early majority is something like 40% of users, I think. I've read this book years ago. I'm just going to make up a number because 98% of statistics are made up on the spot, right? So there's this like really big chunk of people in the early majority, and once they start using it, that's when the like conference train starts to get rolling, and that's when the like tons and tons of more people start using the thing. That's when it becomes like cool, but not too cool, you know? Like, yeah, I don't know a good example to put in there, but it's like, it's a really great time. It's one of my favorite times in a technology being adopted because there's so much vitality and growth and energy, and there's a large number of people, so you can do a lot of stuff. You can get a job using technologies that are in the early majority, and it's really popular. And that's between sort of the early adopter, early majority phase, in that chasm is where I think that Rubyists think that we are. But we haven't been there since like 2008 or 2009, maybe 2010. I don't want to quibble over dates. Time is a social construct anyway. And in my last talk at FOSDEM that I came to right before here, I was like, humans don't perceive time as linear, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to give you this linear presentation, even though I don't think it works that way. Again, that's a different talk. I won't talk about that. The late majority is sort of like the early majority, but it's once everything is really stable and rock solid, and like enterprises. Enterprises use late majority technology, or sometimes laggard technology, the very last category. And I think that Ruby is somewhere in the middle of this late majority / laggards thing, right? Like Ruby is over 20 years old at this point, and 10 years old and like being very popular. I actually found myself recently saying that I didn't want to use a certain new technology because Ruby is so much more productive and stable, and there's so many more libraries that are already available, and like I can just get work done and it's nice and easy, right? That's the sign of something that's in the late or early majorities, not something that's in the like innovator category. And what's funny is, in 2009 or 2010, I would have been the person saying, I don't want to use these other technologies because they're too stable and they don't have anything interesting going on. I'm in Ruby because there's so many more things to do and there's so many interesting activities and there are no libraries. You can just write all the libraries you want. I'll tell you this afterwards. It might be the reason that I'm thinking about this so much is that I just turned 29 a couple weeks ago, and so I'm right on that cusp myself of going from being in my 20s to being in my 30s, which is a scary thing. I'm sure that those of you who have done this know, or maybe not. Maybe I just think about things too often. I remember the hippies that were like, don't trust anyone over 25, and then I found like another quote that said, don't trust anyone over 30, so I've been using that one for the last 4 years. But it's really important. I think that Ruby is going through this very similar transitionary phase. I had a conversation with someone recently where I said, maybe it's just that life is a little different now and that I just don't really want to grow up. And like, I think that Ruby is in the same sort of phase. We want to be breaking things all the time. We want to not be supporting like mature technology. We'd love to like be doing cool, innovative new things, but I think if we don't recognize that we're the like mature adults that are sort of like have already come of age, then Ruby will ultimately go away. And I think that this is one of the big problems because some of our leadership, who will be unnamed, also is not willing to acknowledge this fact. Jeremy Ashkenath said a long time ago that the Rails 2 to 3 transition was what killed Rails because Node.js won. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think there is a certain kernel of truth where after that period of time, we became the man, right? Like, what's that? If you stay alive long enough to see yourself become the villain of the story, right? So Ruby used to be rah, rah, fight the power, but now we're the power in many ways. And this ties in with my earlier point about not talking trash and using other technologies, because if Ruby's going to survive, and I love Ruby, and by survive, obviously the code will still always exist, but I mean getting a job working in Ruby, I would like to see Ruby be in the same place as COBOL, which is not something you may expect to hear someone say, but like, if you're a COBOL programmer, you've been gainfully employed for the last 40+ years doing the programming that I assume that you love. I don't really know. I don't know COBOL programmers that well, so I can't say that for sure, but I would love to be able to get a Ruby job for the next 40 years. I don't know about you, but in order to like do that, in order to make Ruby be able to be around for that long, we have to understand how we're changing. I thought it was really interesting. Yesterday there was a little bit of a talk about like growing up and coming into management, and there was also a talk about adding static typing because those things are useful. And those talks and others, and in many ways our refactoring talks, are all about how Ruby is growing up and how we're sort of adapting and changing as this time goes on. And so I think that's important. But also it's important because of this assemblage concept and this not talking trash concept. We wouldn't be adding static types to Ruby if languages like Go had demonstrated that adding simple static typing is incredibly useful for performance and other maintainability reasons. And if we like keep making fun of other technologies instead of using them and then stealing their good ideas and bringing them back to Ruby, then we're just going to be in our own little bubble and eventually become irrelevant. But we need to like grow and adapt and change over time, and the only way to do that is to like be a polyglot and do other kinds of things and then bring what we love about those things back to Ruby and vice versa. I've been joking that one of the best things that I've done for Rust is to get Yehuda involved, because now with me and him involved in Rust, we're bringing the things that I love about Ruby to the Rust world. A primary example of this, and this is happening the other direction, but I think that the static typing thing is this happening in the opposite direction of what I'm saying. Just said opposite twice. You know what I mean. It's a bidirectional thing. Static typing is us stealing good ideas from other languages. Us giving our good ideas to other languages is what Yehuda and I are doing with Rust. It was pretty much thought that Rust programmers would be needing to write makefiles to continue making their programs. And I don't know how many of you have dealt with makefiles, but sometimes I love makefiles, but oftentimes makefiles make me sad files. And so we were like, hey, in Ruby world, we have this really great idea, and it's called bundler. And there's some people that talk a lot of trash on bundler, but I posit that those people either are part of Seattle RB or don't remember what Ruby was like before bundler. Because Ruby was, like Rails was very hard to develop before bundler. I don't know if you remember trying to install gems and having versions not match and then getting these weird cryptic errors, and like you'd bring someone new onto your team and they wouldn't happen to have the right versions of gems installed, and it would like take a day to get all that figured out. And like as many problems as bundler has, it's so wonderful that you can just like get started in a Rails app and type bundle install and everything is set up for you. So when we saw this happening in the Rust world with makefiles, we were like, this needs to stop. And so we pitched the idea of having bundler in Rust, and that's called cargo. And so they were incredibly skeptical at first, but now we're like amazed that it can be this easy because C++ programmers are used to everything being hard. And so I think this cross-pollination of ideas of like Ruby bringing its concepts of ease of use and the joy of programming to languages that haven't had that before, and languages like C++ bringing ideas of things like performance back to Ruby, which is a totally different talk. I think it's really important that we continue to do that as a community, and so that involves having a lot of respect for other programming systems and ecologies, and also a little bit of understanding and maturity out of ourselves to acknowledge that we're sort of becoming the old people, and that's actually kind of awesome in many ways. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much again for having me here and for coming out, and let's have a great second day of the conference. Thanks.